Again, you've heard about people like Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy and Nelson Mandela. They've all made comments about how injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, right? And that sounds abstract. I've actually heard elite leaders from this university, I won't mention their names, but they've quoted those quotes and they've said, of course, I don't subscribe to that. I don't believe anything that trite. Well, we have a good example right here, with the components in our jewelry, in our mobile phones, in our bling. This isn't an abstract matter. This is a direct example of how we are connected intimately with what goes on in the other side of the world in a culture that's quite foreign to many of us. We haven't grown up in that culture. And so this is, I think, a wonderful example. It's so great that you picked, conflict minerals to spend time on, because it is, you can actually show the personal connection with very serious human rights violations and atrocities. Now, the business connection, of course, is there. There's ample evidence now of business complicity in this violence. Businesses have taken the approach historically of saying, well, that's not us, that's our supplier. They tried to draw a strong line. Even 5 to 7 years ago, going to the UN meetings on this subject, I would hear prominent multinational companies just say, well, we have nothing to do with that. That's our supply chain. That's the reason we have corporations. Limited liability. I think that's changed. And I think a big part of the reason that's changed is the leadership, the actions of Enough in particular, and Stand in recent years. Because the companies aren't saying that anymore. Now they're all struggling. We've got new federal legislation on this. They're struggling with how they're going to meet these new global social expectations. And that's an exciting thing to see. Because they're beginning to recognize that they are responsible actors. That if they're going to be corporate citizens with free speech rights or intellectual property rights under decisions like Citizens United on the free speech side or under the Global Trade-related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement, with those rights, those powers, come responsibility. Whether it's the Torah or the Gospel of Luke or the movie Spider-Man. With power comes responsibility. And the companies now are starting to get that message. They're realizing that as consumers, you demand it, and the rest of the public demands it. That's really good to see. So this new environment of corporate social responsibility is, again, surprising. I would never have predicted it had come this far in the last 10 or 15 years, but it's also very welcome. Now, businesses are generally good. I want to make clear that I believe in business. I believe that businesses can create vital innovation, jobs. Businesses are responsible for a lot of the potential solutions. They want educated workers. So businesses are generally pro-literacy. They're pro an environment of stability because they want the rule of law and investment. Except, of course, for the traditional merchants of death, as Teddy Roosevelt called them, arms suppliers and private military contractors who have a perverse incentive of profiting sometimes from continued conflict. But putting them aside, most businesses are good actors, and when they get involved in human rights violations, it's generally inadvertent. It's because they're partnering with a company or a supplier that is doing bad things. And so the new environment of uber transparency in the world, that we're seeing sweeping the world and erupting in magnificent developments like the Arab Spring most recently, the reforms in Tunisia, Egypt, and we hope there'll be peaceful reforms in other countries. That environment is producing responsible businesses, or businesses that are at least trying to do better. Now, the aberrational exceptions of prime relevance to the Congo are twofold. First of all, when the environment has such difficult aspect of like a Hobbesian war of all against all, that it's really tough to think about how there will be economic dynamism and entrepreneurial business development. That's the first problem. The second problem, of course, is when wars and conflict do perpetuate and benefit, or are perpetuated by certain businesses, the businesses that benefit them. Now, I wrestled with the first issue at Nokia, trying to get the company to invest more in Africa. And the company wasn't willing to do this in the late 90s. It just wasn't perceived as a market where there was disposable income, where there could be a good business. Well, that turned out to be wrong. What happened is then indigenous telephone companies came in and ended up making tens of billions of dollars. Nokia and the other big multinationals rushed in and tried to make money. But that stereotype of being an economic basket case, as we know, still afflicts the DRC and sometimes other countries in Africa today. And there are enormous challenges there. I mean, the DRC is at the very bottom. It's like the worst or the second worst country in the world on the index of places that are easy or hard to do business in. And in addition to that, of course, there is this ongoing conflict. And yet, despite these problems, you've got tremendous potential. You heard about the tens of trillions of resources, literally one of the richest countries in the world in terms of resources. And it was one of the leading coffee producers in prior decades. So it has a lot of potential. It's already had, in the last few years, more economic growth, despite the financial crisis and despite all these challenges, than the U.S. in relative terms. In percentage terms, it's had a greater percentage of growth. And the East is the more, problematic area. And so businesses, I think, should recognize, and you might want to consider in your activism, that there are really opportunities to get in early in rights-respecting ways that can build the environment of peace, stability, and the rule of law. It's the second issue, though, that we're most concerned with today, and that's with the role of businesses in perpetuating conflict, either unintentionally or intentionally. And I actually wrestled with that issue as well. When I was at Nokia in the late 90s, I got a call from a media organization saying, what about your role in, and he wasn't talking about my personal role, but the company's role in supporting coltan, conflict minerals for the Congo. And I said, what is coltan? I didn't know. But, as David said earlier, this is not a new issue. It did come up, with my company at least, in the late 90s. And within a couple of years, there were magazine articles. Very briefly, I'll just say that, we then got that issue on our radar screen. We started investigating the situation, starting to talk to our suppliers. We finally figured out what is coltan. Nokia today, it's not a perfect company, but I'm proud to say my former company is, along with HP and some of the other companies you've heard about, it's taking the issue seriously. It's a participant in the industry associations, the Jesse Initiative, and so forth. And it's been, recognized as one of the leaders in this area, which is a comfort for me because I would be embarrassed to get up here as a former Nokia person and have the opposite be true. But there's still issues that Nokia is facing, and I'll talk about those a little bit more in a while. Let me turn now to the second part of the talk, which is on the legal framework, the legal issues. And there, we're really, again, seeing remarkable development. You've heard about the Dodd-Frank legislation 1502, so I won't go into detail about that. I'll mention it. But I want to make the point that at every single level of the system, extraordinary things are happening. Whether you're talking about the United Nations Security Council, which has been apprised of the situation now for a decade, and has had a succession of increasingly strong resolutions, on the issue, putting the peacekeepers in place. But the last couple of resolutions are, they're recognizing quite directly the link between conflict minerals and businesses. And they're saying businesses have to have due diligence in order to avoid complicity. That's extraordinary. For the UN Security Council, under Chapter 7, the breach of the peace provisions of the UN Charter, some of the strongest international provisions of the world, to say this, again, is very welcome and extraordinary to me. I'm very happy to see it. And then you've got them working with other international organizations. For example, as early as the expert group's consideration to 2000, 2002, you had an expert panel convened by the Security Council that was looking, using the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, looking at the Congo. And they identified, approximately a couple of hundred companies. About a half of those ended up reforming their practices. The other half left the Congo. Now, the ones that are reforming it, some of them later got into problems. But the point is that this is very much on the international agenda. It has been for more than 10 years. Now, there are reasons that we'll get into as to why we haven't made more progress despite that.